theyeshiva.net.
Another very important component that I want to address is how the Rambam describes those who don't have a chelik in Olam Haba. So he says in Halacha Beis that the soul, what does he say in Halacha Beis? I'm sorry, he says in Halacha Aleph, that if you're not zoichet to this life, you get cut off in your wickedness and you lost like a behemoth, like an animal, and that's karis. You lost like an animal, and that's karis. Okay, that's what he says. He comes back to this in Halacha Hey, where he says the greatest retribution is that the soul is cut off, and it doesn't have Olam Haba, and this is the ultimate loss. It gets completely destroyed, and it never comes back. That's what the Rambam writes. Now, I should say, this also created a major controversy, because some people said, the Rambam doesn't believe in Gehenna. He doesn't believe that there's any process of cleansing and punishment in the world to come. He says, the soul just gets lost, and that's it. The soul just gets cut off and lost. And this was also a reason that some of the rabbis in France wanted to ban Sefer Hamad. The Rambam doesn't believe in Gehenna. He doesn't mention it. He says, the Rishayim come to Olam Haba, the soul gets cut off. That's it. It just gets lost. That's it. Lost, perished. There's no punishment. There's no cleansing. The Rabbeinu Moshe ben Nachman wrote a fiery letter to the rabbis of France, where with fire and brimstone he defends the Rambam. He says it's not true. Of course, the Rambam believed in Gehenna. Again, read Hilchos Teshuvah Perek Gimel. The Rambam says that there are those who come to the next world after they pass away, and they go through Danin Oisam Kafi Chetem. They get judged in the future world according to their sin. They get cleansed, and then they go to Olam Haba. The Rambam describes that over there. The Rambam also says over there that those who don't have a chelik in Olam Haba, what does he say? He says they get cut off. The Rambam's language is Nidoinin al goydel rishasam v'chatasam la'olam la'olam me'elamim. They get judged for their wickedness forever. So the Ramban says, how do you say that the Rambam doesn't believe in all of this? He said it clearly in Perek Gimel. The Ramban says even those who argued with the Rambam know that his words are sacred and you can trust them. And he says whoever opens up a sefer does not shut it. This is the famous defense of the Ramban on this element as well. But there does seem then to be a little contradiction, because in Hilchos Teshuvah Perek Gimel Halacha Vav he says those who don't have a chelik in Olam Haba, they get cut off, they get lost, and they're judged for their wickedness forever and ever and ever. What do you mean? If they're lost, so they're not judged. Are the souls lost forever or they're judged forever? Here he doesn't even say they're judged. Here it just sounds like the soul gets cut off and it gets lost forever and ever, but it contradicts, seems, what he writes in Hilchos Teshuvah Perek Vav. As I mentioned then, especially in the question and answer segment on Perek Shlishi, there are some Mefarshim who explain that the Rambam is, you have to read the Rambam a little more carefully. If you're getting lost, you can't be judged. And what they say is, based on what is explained in many Sfarim, particularly in the writings of the Arizal, in the writings of the Alshich, in the writings of the Shalah, in the writings of Rabbeinu Menachem Azariah of Fanu, in the writings of Emek HaMelech, that ultimately every soul has a tikkun. Every single soul, even if it gets judged and judged and judged, because, as they put it, it's Neitzer Matoya, it's a Chelik Elikam Imal. If it's a Tzelem Elikim, if it's a, so to speak, a fragment of divinity, it can get lost. Ultimately, the divine must come back to the divine. It may have to go through a very, very intense process. But at the end, every soul, every soul has a tikkun. Every single soul. The Yerushalmi says in Kilayim Perek Tes that even Yeravam ben Nevat says, Ein lechelik le'olam haba, even he comes to Olam Haba, the Yerushalmi says. And the Gemara says in Sanhedrin, Dershei Yerushalmi say, that Yeravam ben Nevat and some of the others do have a chelik in Olam Haba. So the point that these Sfarim explain is that the soul may have to go through a lot, and initially they don't have a chelik in Olam Haba. But ultimately, they will have a chelik in Olam Haba. They do describe that there are souls that in the ultimate Olam Haba, defined as Tchias HaMesim, like the Ravid says, some may come back, but in different bodies. Maybe the bodies will be lost, some unique Rishayim. But the soul always ultimately has a tikkun. And some explain that's why the Rambam says they get lost, but then he says they're judged forever. So they're not lost, so they're judged forever. Is explained in some smarim. They're judged for many worlds, for many eons, but then when there's going to be ultimately a new world of Chiyas HaMesim, then these souls come back. They come to their tikkun. Ein lam chelik l'olam haba would mean that initially they don't have a chelik in olam haba until they go through a very, very profound process. Yeah. More about this we discussed in the question and answer segment in Perek Shlishi. Here, the Rambam doesn't even mention the punishments. He just mentions that it gets lost. The Ramban has an essay about reward and punishment called Shar HaGmul, and the Ramban challenges these words of the Rambam, and he says you can't have a soul that is completely lost. That doesn't exist, a soul that is completely lost, even though that's what it sounds from the Rambam. One way of explaining it and reconciling it may be, based on what the Rambam says, that the person is lost like an animal. Yeah. And if you notice, he used a very interesting expression in Perek Shmini, in Halacha Aleph. He said, Hikaris, she'oisa nefesh she'parsha min haguf ba'olam haza eina zoicha l'chai olam haba gam min ha'olam haba nechras. The soul that left the body in olam haza is not zoicha to chai olam haba, gets cut off from olam haba. What does he mean? The soul that left the body in olam haza? Of course it didn't. Of course it left the body in olam haza. What does he mean? She'parsha min haguf ba'olam haza. Perhaps what the Rambam is saying is, I'm not sure about this, I'm just suggesting it as a possibility. What the Rambam is saying is, how does a person lose Olam Haba? It's not so easy to lose Olam Haba. A person has to sin with full consciousness and volition. A person who didn't have Bechira, a person who was mistaken, a person who did Teshuvah, a person who regretted, a person who was forced. These are not people who are losing Olam Haba. Losing Olam Haba is a serious thing. It's a person who basically ceases to live by the Tzelem Elikim. The Rambam described earlier, he described in Perek Vav, right? People like Paroi or Sichain, who were such heinous criminals, who were such evil people, and they chose to be evil. Hashem said, I'm not giving them the opportunity to do tshuva. So they'll die without tshuva. You're talking about unique situations. Maybe not always unique, but it's not like, a person makes a mistake, they lose their Olam Haba. But essentially it means a person who lost their Tzelem Elikim. They're not operating anymore with the Tzelem Elikim, with the Nefesh. They're operating on a neshama level. They're operating basically as beasts, as animals. The law of the jungle dictates. Might prevails over right. There's no moral law, there's no moral boundaries. They lose their divinity, they lose what makes humans, that moral sensitivity. They live like a behemoth. And he says, Avad ke behemoth. So they die like animals. He says, that soul that's separated from the guf and Olam Haza, in other words, that soul that left them, that nefesh that left them, it gets cut off, and as the Rambam says here, they get completely cut off. So their entire life, their entire consciousness, there's nothing that remains of it. It's just dead. Another person who lived with their nefesh, with their tzuris nefesh, that nefesh is in Olam Haba. It already began in this world, because they were living with Hashem, with truth in this world, and then they go to Olam Haba. But by then, they were completely divorced, so there's nothing left. However, the truth is that every Jew, Kol Yisrael, every Jew has a soul somewhere, even if it's deeply hidden and it was not in his or her consciousness, and it did not come out. Yeah. That can't get lost. The Chelik Elekam Imal can't get lost. Vayipach ba'apav nishmas chayim. It says in Zohar, man de nafach mitoiche nafach. When you blow, you're blowing from your inside. It comes from the core, so to speak, of Hashem. That can't get lost. There's goodness over there, but it's completely not conscious. It's completely not in the force. So that the Rambam is not even addressing here. That he addressed in Perek Gimel. Perek Gimel he addressed that soul will go through a lot of cleansing because of how it was tarnished. And then, after La'olam Ul'olam Elamim, it will have its tikkun as explained in Svarim. Here the Rambam is just addressing the component of that this person's life, the way they lived, that soul, there's no Olam Haba, that soul is just, it's not Zoiche to this life, and it's lost forever. There is an element of the life of their soul which they didn't live with, that was not part of their consciousness, that goes through various processes until it will reach its ultimate tikkun. There's a beautiful whole shtickle of Reb Tzadok HaKohen on this, Takonas HaShovim, Tzadok HaKohen of Lublin, where he discusses at length this process, a whole section on Emek HaMelech by Reb Naftali Hertz, a student of Rabbi Yisrael Srug, one of the students of the Arizal, a whole section on Asara Mamoris by Rabbeinu Menachem Azaria of Panu about this, based on the writings of the Arizal, and a great compilation of many of the ideas was made by the Lubavitcher Rebbe in a letter that he wrote to somebody, in an essay that he published in 1945 about this, which is published in his letters, in his Igris, volume 1, I think a 10 or 15 page essay with all of the footnotes and references to explain the Shitta of the Chazal and the Rishonim and the Mekabolim in this area, even though from the Rambam he's not so explicit and he's not so clear about many of these details. I should also add that this is talking about a soul that is really divine. It's a chelik kamimal. You could say it's Neitzer Matoy Maisayadai Lispoir. You also have sometimes people whose sins, whose acts of barbarity, sadism, brutality, selfishness were so severe. Talking about the Stalins of the world, the Hitlers of the world, Yimach Shemam v'Zichram, and also people of lower degrees of evil, killers, murderers, bloodthirsty terrorists, etc. And here, the Rambam is perhaps saying it very literally. They get punished and they're lost. Their souls perish, whatever type of soul there is. And it's tragic that a human being who is carved in God's image should be able to descend to such evil. But there's also comfort in knowing that the perpetrators of 9/11 don't have the same fate like the victims of 9/11. It would be horrendous to consider that the perpetrators of the Holocaust and the victims of the Holocaust end up with the same ultimate fate. No, they don't end up with the same ultimate fate. There are souls that get punished, and punished very severely, and as the Rambam says, are lost. But perhaps there are other souls, Kol Yisrael Yesh Lam Chelik Lam Haba, that ultimately receive a tikkun. I just think that's also worthwhile to make that distinction that's also brought in the Svarim of Emek HaMelech and Rameh Mifano and the Arizal and other Svarim that I mentioned earlier.
This class is brought to you by theyeshiva.net. Please help us continue the classes. Make even a small contribution at www.theyeshiva.net/donate.